Okay, so in order to stay on schedule, we are going to go ahead and get to our next speaker, and that is Sean Park from the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs.
Yeah, hi everybody. So it's a little bit of an abrupt shift from climate change to cooperatives. Other than the fact that I think most of the folks that are on this call have those same sort of interests. So I think it makes sense. It's just a sudden shift. And I know we want to talk a little bit about worker cooperatives, but I thought maybe not knowing what everyone's background was, I would back up a little bit and start from the beginning, a little bit about what cooperatives are first before we get too far into it. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Yeah, so I am the program manager at the Illinois Co-op Development Center, which, as we mentioned, was part of the Illinois Institute for Rural Affairs at Western Illinois University. Although I did actually do my undergraduate here in Carbondale, so I lived here for about 5 years. Ran my own business right out of college, worked corporate for a little while. Was a small business development center advisor for a while, and now manage a couple different programs at WIU. And tell you that a little bit because yes, I work in the cooperative space, but my background is really as an economist and as an entrepreneur. So a little bit just the basics of the co-op model. I'm trying to keep us on track here. So what is a cooperative? It's a legally incorporated business owned by its members who use its services. Like other businesses, co-op requires startup capital, generates revenue to cover its costs. So that's going to be a theme here. You're going to hear me say that a lot, but that it's treated like a business. Must provide quality services, can distribute profits back to its owners, can retain those profits for future needs. That really is where, when you hear to talk about tax benefits of a cooperative, that really is one of the biggest benefits. There's certain tax breaks that we can do for that. Goal is financial self-sufficiency. So a lot of cooperatives, when they get going, especially food cooperatives, tend to rely on continual donations, grants, and that's really not what we want to do. We really want them to be self-sustaining businesses. They provide limited liability for member owners. That's important. That means no one's going to, should that co-op, well, a lot of you are probably members here in town at the co-op, and should something happen there, it doesn't work out, no one's going to come to those members for debt collection. So that's what that means. Can borrow money and sign contracts just like any other corporation, and pays business taxes. That's another thing that people tend to think you don't do. How they differ from private enterprises. So the owners benefit from use of the co-op services. It's not necessarily about the financial return, even though we need to be self-sustaining. It's there to provide a service. That's really what we're trying to do. Decision-making is democratic, one member, one vote, not based on the number of shares. So if I'm the majority shareholder, doesn't mean I get more say than everybody else. So it's actually a very American democratic thing. Profits are allocated based on the use of the co-op services. So the more you use that co-op, the more you are returning profits back, or the more profits are returned back to you. So that's why they ask, if you're a member of the co-op, every time you shop, you're going to be returned back more if you're there more often. Same thing with the utilities. So the Egyptian Electric Co-op, same sort of thing. You'll see at the end of the year, you'll see a rebate on your bill. A lot of folks don't know what that is, but that's actually your return on the profits for the co-op. Co-op business assets are owned collectively by local members, cannot be used for private gain. In other words, I can't take out a loan on the co-op's assets myself just because I'm a member. Co-ops have stated social as well as economic goals. Profit is not the only concern. And that gets back to that. Why are we doing this? It provides a service. Yes, it does have to be financially sustainable, but it's providing a service that the private sector doesn't at this point. So co-op structure, roles and responsibilities. How does this thing work? Has a board of directors that's elected by the members. Usually that board of directors meets about once a month. Proactively directs co-op operations based on co-op principles, legislation, the bylaws that are written by the members, and the policies. Selects, supervises, and provides direction and management. So usually they're hiring a manager, manages and protects the assets of the co-op, provides membership with full accounting of cooperative activities and directions. It's usually an annual meeting where you can attend and they'll tell you how we did this year, what was going on, what some of the issues were. You can also break this up into members as committees. And so the committees can be part of the board or they can be separate but governed by the board. So in other words, I don't have to be on the board to be part of the committee. Delegated authority for specific tasks or projects. In other words, you may be in charge of certain events and that's your field. So you're on your own there, but you do report back to the board who then reports to the members. Supporting relationships outlined in bylaws, terms of reference, standing committees. So these are some of the ones that may be there, usually on the board for finance and audit, but member communications for a small co-op. Sometimes that's not with the board, but other members take that over. Staff relations, probably a board issue where board members talk to those employees in the business. Those committees may be short-term, usually a board member, maybe 2-3 years. Short-term might be just, several months. How does this compare with other sectors? Public sector, federal, state, municipal governments that provide public services, they're paid for by our tax revenues. Private sector, business and organizations that provide services for the public to maximize profit for individual gain. So they actually have a legal responsibility to provide the most profit to their owners. That's a completely different, when you get to that point, that's a completely different thought process than the social economy sector. Nonprofit organizations and businesses that respond to socioeconomic needs of communities. Co-ops are part of this sector. This is probably a good time to mention, you hear co-ops and you hear nonprofit and they're often confused. And I'm very, very adamant about co-ops are a business. You'll hear co-ops as a nonprofit business. They're actually really a not-profit business. They return all the profit that they have either back into the co-op or back to the members. So there's not a profit-driven amount of money just sitting there. So it's not really a nonprofit, it's a no profit. That profit is returned back to the owner. How are they unique? Well, again, as I'd mentioned, private sector seeks to maximize profitability for its investors with the co-op, seeks to provide members with needed services at the lowest possible cost. Different control structure. The amount of invested capital dictates the level of voting control for a corporation. With cooperative, each member has one vote, irrespective of the amount of capital invested. So if I'm a member, I can invest more into that cooperative. It doesn't give me any more votes, but just might mean that I believe in that cause. And the allocation of profit again. So let's say this entity makes money in the private sector, we divvy that out based on how much you've invested. Right? In co-ops, we divide that out based on how much you've used that service. So if you've shopped there more than anybody else, you're probably going to get the largest chunk coming back. So co-ops operate in a wide variety of business sectors, not just grocery stores or credit unions. And of course, we're also talking about worker-owned cooperatives, but co-ops can be used for rural home care. We use a lot of small town cooperatives for businesses, everything from movie theaters to keep those in small rural towns to grocery stores, daycares. It's another big sector that's starting to open up as well as the cost of childcare goes up. So you have a daycare cooperative where the parents actually are the members. They're subject to co-op legislation. So they're not controlled by government, but they also don't have the exact same legislation as a corporation. They have a separate statute. In Illinois, the worker-owned cooperative was just reworked and added, I'd say 2019, I believe was right. Before that, we didn't have a separate worker-owned cooperative. Everything was split into agricultural co-ops and pretty much everything else. So they had two halves. And those are run by different agencies even. You go through the Secretary of State to register, but then the Ag Department deals with you if you have an agricultural co-op. So cooperatives have a higher survival rate than other businesses. So they don't move as fast in terms of making decisions. In fact, sometimes co-ops move a little slow, but by being slow, a lot of times they're more cautious. So that helps with the decision-making process. They make profits, employ local people, contribute to local economies. Again, that's part of that social aspect that's baked into it, part of the cooperative principles. And non-charities or not-profit organizations that, again, they're there for profit, but that profit is returned to everybody in the community. So a few essentials you look for when you start a cooperative. Of course, it needs to meet the needs of the members. Otherwise, you're not going to have enough members to even be interested. Be economically viable, secure financing. Have strong member patronage and participation. In other words, the people that are involved are active in that cooperative. They use its services, they make decisions. It has to deliver top quality services at a reasonable cost. And you can't create a cooperative and then charge people a lot more money and say, well, it's for a good cause. Unfortunately, people won't shift their shopping patterns that way. Make board staff member education a priority. In other words, cooperative boards are a little different. They're not a bunch of business people that were elected to run the company. And that's a good thing. A lot of times you get a lot of different viewpoints when you're creating that board out of its members. You know, everybody's got a different background, which means everyone has a different specialty. On the other hand, we do need to educate those board members on how the business works and how cooperatives work. So that becomes a priority that other businesses don't have. Hire competent and committed management staff. That's tough because cooperatives tend to start out on a shoestring budget, and hiring someone that's, you know, talented in that field can be difficult. Now, worker-owned cooperatives have a little bit of a benefit there, right? They're going to hire the folks in a lot of cases that were already running that business. So they have an advantage right away. Have strong leadership and succession plan. Succession planning is not something a lot of people think of when you start a business, but it might look, what's that look like? It might look like a plan for when this business is ended, if we're planning on that, or it might look like, you know, different stages of growth. Has a positive relationship with the community. Again, that's really a large part of what makes a cooperative. It's there to provide that service that wasn't there before. That's part of the reason we have so many rural electric boards. You know, you get down to that last house when we were talking about electrifying America, that last house, it just didn't make financial sense to run wiring all the way up to their house to provide that. So a company by itself won't do it. And that's where the rural electric comes in. It's a group of citizens themselves saying, well, yeah, it doesn't make financial sense, but it makes social sense, and we'd like to help that person out. So farmers actually drove a lot of that rural electrification. Again, it's fitting a need that the free market won't fit by itself. So they buy and hire local as much as possible. There's a good reason for that. You know, not only is it just fit that social model, but a lot of times those members are also local. So the more you interact, the stronger your co-op's going to be. Be adaptable to changing business environments. Kind of going back to that whole, it's really a business. It's got to be prepared to change if that's what happens. The worker-owned cooperative. Real nuts and bolts here. This is what you would do in Illinois if you were going to start. So you need to understand the Cooperatives Act. Again, that statute specifically was enacted in 2019. It asks for a minimum of 3 members to start a worker cooperative. And to do that, you have to submit an Articles of Incorporation, which are listed in that Co-op Act, explain exactly what you need to say in your Articles of Incorporation. And then there's a required fee. The limited liability corporation fee has come down quite a bit over the last 5 years, but the co-op fee is still right around the same as a corporation. I believe it runs somewhere around $500 to get incorporated. Optional things that you can have at that time, and it's always good to be planning ahead, or a draft of your bylaws. So bylaws differ from the articles of incorporation in that they're a little more specific on what our day-to-day plans are. How do we handle adding new members? How do we divvy up that money? Things like that. And also a business plan. Now, business plan is a lot like bylaws, but it expands into more nuts and bolts thing, like what are our hours of operations, things like that. What is our target market? Big difference in business plans. In Illinois, we don't have to have those two things to incorporate, but in other states you do. I've been doing some work in Nebraska, and they require both of those things before you can become a legal entity. So that's usually reviewed by your Secretary of State. All states are a little different. Wisconsin, Minnesota have great co-op laws. Some states barely have any. But after that review process, you receive a certificate of incorporation, and that is making you a legal entity in your state. So you're doing business as an Illinois legal entity. Just a couple of real quick examples. The Arizmendi Bakery, it's out in the San Francisco area, was really an offshoot of another local cooperative. It went really well. It had been open for, I think, 20 years at the time, roughly 15 years. And so just an offshoot of this is a worker-owned cooperative where the folks that run the bakery actually own the bakery. It's gone well enough in that San Francisco Bay Area over the last 25 years that it has 4 other offshoots now by itself. So there are different Arizmendi bakeries around the Bay Area. This was one that a colleague of mine worked on. This is one of 3 different businesses, and it's an island, small community in the New England area. And because of all the different waterways up there, it's actually fairly isolated. It's not, you know, in terms of direct distance, it's not that far from the next shopping center. But in terms of drive time, it's quite a bit different. So this small community had 3 businesses, all owned by one gentleman. He had at the time about 60 employees, and he was looking to retire. Now, in one of his businesses is an Ace Hardware. He actually purchased from a cooperative, which gives those guys, they run their own business, but it's a purchasing cooperative, which allows them to buy things at a better price. So he was familiar with the concept. When he was approached by Rob Brown, who works at the Cooperative Development Institute, about it, he was open to it. Not a lot of owners are, but he was open to selling the business to his employees. And so it started the discussion of, well, should this be 3 cooperatives? It ended up being one large cooperative purchased by the employees. That cooperative actually supplies all the grocery, hardware, prescription drugs, pharmacy items, craft supplies, gas for that community. So it was really, really important to keep those businesses going. Ended up with 45 out of the 60 employees decided that they wanted to buy into it. So the other 15, they're non-owner employees. They stayed on, they still work, but when it comes time to make those decisions, they don't get that vote. And that's fairly common. Not everybody wants to join in. Not everybody thinks they're going to be there for the long haul. This had a few bumps in the road. You know, you're talking about a fairly complicated situation. Just the pharmacy regulations alone can be fairly daunting. And it had some legacy issues. The owner really wanted to sell, but he still wanted to have a say in his business, and he was stepping out. So once he was out of the business, it became a little bit of a tension between what he thought they should be doing and what they were doing. So support services, if you're thinking about this, that first section there, that's me, the Illinois Co-op Development Center. And I can make these slides available for everybody if they need them. Another great source is the Food Co-op Initiative. Now, of course, they specialize in food co-ops, but they have some great stuff on their website, a nice library of what board directors do and things like that. And then specifically for worker-owned cooperatives, you have to look for the Democracy at Work Institute, and it's at institute.coop.coop. they have specific things for worker conversions there. Another one not listed here is Kent State in Ohio. They have a worker-owned program there that does both employee stock option plans and cooperative changes as well. So those are kind of some of the basics of that. It's a lot to dig into, and each individual business is going to be different when you're talking about an existing business converting over. It's a little bit easier when we start from scratch, except for we don't have any assets to start with as well. But so each project's a little different, and at our center, we work with each individual group as if it's a standalone business. So that's kind of my presentation, and I don't know if we have time for any questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Sean. We do have some questions, and it is kind of a weird transition from climate change to worker cooperatives. But the first thing that pops into my head is, the economic diversification aspect. But what would you say, how does this tie into the climate change angle?
Well, the biggest way that ties in, I think, is that a lot of times I do a lot of work with small rural grocery stores, and when we talk about that store, a lot of times the biggest thing that you can make money out of are those gaming machines where you sit down and you put the money in, and you see those in a lot of small towns. And you don't really blame the guy for doing that, because he has a family to feed, and that's a business that's based on making a profit so that he can make a living. Whereas with a socially owned business like this, we can stop and go, yeah, we could make some money there, or we can try to make some money somewhere else that's not going to be as profitable. But instead, we can put in a produce case there, right? So we can make that decision that's not necessarily the economic decision, but the social decision, and still manage a business. And I think when it comes to climate change, that's exactly the same situation, right? Yeah, we can hook right up to whatever fossil fuel we want to run this business, or we can make that decision to use solar panels, to buy, renewable energy, some other method. We can compost. All those decisions can be made not necessarily on a profit basis, where through a regular corporation, your obligation as a board member, as a manager, is to maximize profits. That's an actual legal obligation. So it draws that difference there, right? We can make the decision that we feel is better for the community.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sean. And I know you're busy around town here this weekend, and hopefully we'll be seeing more of you in the future. Thank you so much.
Yep, you're welcome.